Water justice has emerged as a social crisis occurring worldwide. A shrinking fresh water supply, due to aging infrastructure, insufficient policy, and climate change, threatens our quality of life.
Really, water needs to be looked at as a system. I am concerned about infrastructure when you talk about water leakage or water loss, and I mean treated water. After it's been treated and gone through the process, the municipal process, that costs a great deal of money and time and energy in itself to clean and purify and provide water. To then move that clean, purified, and ready to use water out from the facility to the homes is a process of pipes and connections.
So when Detroit was developed, like a lot of older cities in the country, they had pipes for water coming out of people's homes, wastewater out of your toilets, out of your sink, out of your shower, and that needed to go to a water treatment plant. You can't drink that water again. You can't just release it into the creeks and rivers.
In the urban areas, we have something called combined sewer systems, where both stormwater and sewage are in the same drain, the same pipes.
But they also decided to run all of the stormwater. This is water that flows over the roads, flows off of roofs, and goes into a catch basin, the grates you see along the curb lines and stuff like that. Those go into pipes, and it's the same pipes as the water that comes out of the yucky stuff, basically. So all flow to the water treatment plant.
And when we have more intense storms like we're having because of our warming climate, then that results in these combined sewer overflows where both sewage, raw sewage, as well as partially treated sewage overflow into the Detroit and Rouge rivers.
You also have all the water that's coming off of the roads too. And once you mix 1 tablespoon of the stuff coming from your toilet with 50 gallons of the stuff coming off of the street, it's over, right? You have a tremendous amount of water that has to be cleaned, filtered, chlorinated, made okay to be able to release into our riverways again.
Recently, impacts felt disproportionately across geography, race, and social class have become part of a heated debate surrounding water rights.
Water, when you think about it, it connects all of us. It binds us together, or it can really tear a community apart. If you're talking about 80,000 water shutoffs in the community, you're talking about a large swath of the community being cut off to cleanliness, cut off to the ability just to live in a healthy way, and then turned on to things like an outbreak of hepatitis. I mean, those are the types of things that happen when water is weaponized, in my mind.
The cost of water has risen significantly in the last 10 to 15 years. And I think understanding that some of that has come about because of the need to protect water quality is an important part of that factor that I think often is overlooked. We have a high cost because we have the Great Lakes. The Great Lakes are 25% of the world's fresh surface water and 95% of the fresh surface water in the United States. And that's a huge benefit to us, but it's also requires some work on our part to protect and be good stewards of that fresh water.
The Great Lakes specifically, I've seen our attitudes around water and our interactivity and relationship to water shift dramatically. First, as we've started to introduce these conversations around green infrastructure and nature-based infrastructure, we've seen it go from a very foreign idea to many here locally to something that's becoming more and more embraced. There are more and more local applications of green infrastructure, community groups wanting to install rain gardens and figure out how to have water catchment systems in their homes.
I'm not sure exactly how it refers to the water, but being in this neighborhood, we have had floods and we've had sewage backup. We've had more sewage backup than we've had floods.
The Great Lakes contain 27% of the world's fresh water supply. Until recently, residents of Detroit, Michigan have viewed water as an infinite resource.
I knew that there was a fight between the suburbs and the city over water prices, but I never really understood the basis for that fight. As a lifelong Detroiter, I didn't understand that in the 1970s the EPA had fined Detroit because we were dumping so many billion gallons of water every year and polluting the Detroit River and the Rouge River. I had no idea. I grew up with the understanding that our water was clean. I did not understand that we were dirtying the water, the fresh water around us.
The city, bordered on the east by Lake St. Clair and on the west by Lake Erie, sits on an abundant freshwater strait, the Detroit River.
Like a single-family home mecca for a big city. And there are very few places except for right downtown where things went up. Everything went out. So the footprint of Detroit being able to hold the footprint of Manhattan, Boston, and San Francisco, all within the footprint of Detroit. So in other words, it is incredibly spread out because so many people had single-family homes. Instead of like apartment buildings where you go up, they went out. So because of that, there are hundreds of miles of pipes that you have to build and maintain.
Until 2016, Detroit maintained both physical and financial control of the water and sewage services of the river. The city's control spanned Detroit and the surrounding suburbs as far as Flint. Most Detroiters view water as an absolute right, a source of pride, and an inherent benefit of residents.
Some ways that water is being overused, or perhaps another way of looking at that is people using more water maybe than the average person. And I would say simple things like if you take a 20-minute shower, that's just unnecessary. I think the question that people will come to mind is, well, if I can afford to do that, then why not? I can pay my water bill. Honestly, watering your lawn. I live in a neighborhood and people are very concerned about manicured lawns, and so, but yet if you think about it, this is water that's being put into the ground. But it's something to consider and think about when there are people who are struggling to pay for water, right? And yet you're using water to pour on the ground. So it's something to consider. So it's kind of a closed loop system.
What we don't consider is the fact that all of these problems that we're having with water right now are interconnected, and they're all being addressed, or the entity responsible for addressing all of these problems is the Detroit Water and Sewage Department.
In my mind, it's a right. It's a human right. It's been commodified to a place where profit we've seen proliferate to the center of the conversation in too many instances. And it reminds me, there was a comedian that used to talk about wanting to put his heir in his mama's name because of the cost at some point that we would be charged for air. And we would laugh at that years ago, but when you look at what's happening with water now, one can only look a little more sober when we talk about other natural resources and other things that we naturally take for granted.
Other states struggled with droughts and water restrictions, while southeastern Michigan remained largely removed.
Certain conversations elicit certain information. When I'm talking at work, I have to remind my colleagues that water affordability and water assistance are two different things, and they're not interchangeable words.
So when you start looking at fire service, fire protection, when you look at every other city service is administered to citizens as a right of being here. And then you have water. You can't live without water. You cannot maintain hygiene without water. And yet we commodify water to the extent that we have people we are willing to let live without hygiene in their homes because they didn't pay their bill. And we turned it into a moral thing, as though poverty and the inability to pay a bill has some moral character, and it doesn't.
So when we talk about water affordability, we're talking about someone being benevolent, putting some money somewhere aside for those who get a little bit when they need it, but once it runs out, it runs out. When we talk about water affordability, we're talking about codifying into policy the ability for human beings to be able to access affordable water, and it's commensurate on a formula that's structured. But codifying something into law, affordability, is different than putting benevolence into a pot of money somewhere and assisting someone. We need both, but one is the nail, the other is the icing.
I think that people look at water issues in silos. So people say, hey, The big issue in 2014, in addition to the flood, were the big water shutoffs and the fact that the water department was shutting off tens of thousands of residents' water because of unpaid bills. So we know that's a problem. We know the street flooding is a problem. We know sewer backups are a problem, and in fact, those backups happened twice in 2016 in the Jeff Chalmers area, where sewer water was backing up into people's homes. So we know these are problems, and we look at them as isolated things.
In 2014, under renewed financial oversight, Detroit's relationship to water began to change. The city of Detroit shut service off to residents with unpaid bills and battle lines formed. City officials and policy experts viewed water as a commodity, while residents and their allies view water as a right.
Why is it that water, which is essential for life, water which is essential for sanitation and for public health and the prevention of disease transmission, should never be optional? It should never be treated like a commodity. It is not only a right, but it's a need. It's an individual need, it's a family health need, and it's a public need. Well, what about the tenant who lives in a rental home whose landlord hasn't paid the water? Why aren't they given the same consideration as the tenant in an apartment building whose landlord is a little bigger in size but also has not paid the bill? And what about the low-income mother and the senior citizen and the person in a household where there's a severe illness who has not paid the water bill? Are we not worried about those vulnerable populations? We need to start looking at the essential nature of water. And I believe, look at water as something that is delivered to residents, to households in our community, irrespective of income and irrespective of their prior history in paying a bill. But that requires dramatic reform at the state level.
There's a process of pipes and connections, and as those are aged and as they are not able to be maintained, financially able and human resource able, when you think about city employees that generally have taken care of those types of issues, as cities have downsized and laid off and privatized and outsourced, those types of those job skills and the loss, the institutional knowledge and loss is a problem.
The emerging crisis further escalated in July of 2014. The heaviest rainstorm in Detroit's history overwhelmed its aging infrastructure and impermeable surfaces, flooding basements, streets, highways, and waterways.
Climate-related weather events, extreme weather events have really brought the conversation more to the fore. So infrastructure tends to be the thing we don't really pay a lot of attention to because it's invisible. It's usually underground, it's out of sight, and it's not a problem until it's a crisis. But we've had several crises, and people in the community are, really being impacted in a number of ways. It's very traumatic when you come home and your basement is filled up with multiple feet of water. You're losing personal heirlooms that are irreplaceable in many regards, and it's a traumatic event to go through. It really has given us, I think, an opportunity to have these conversations around infrastructure and what does that mean and what role can an individual citizen play in that conversation in terms of influencing how the decisions are made, how the resources are spent, where the projects happen. And I think it's important for community-based organizations like Eastside Community Network, Alliance for the Great Lakes, and many others that are working on this issue here in the city of Detroit to figure out how to help elevate those voices, those citizen voices, to the decision-making process so that they can help influence how those changes happen and they can ultimately reduce some of the burdens that they're experiencing as a result of the failing infrastructure.
Throughout the region, water injustice became highlighted by a failure to remediate the biohazards caused by flooding and sewer backups.
So being a resident of the East Side, specifically in the airport district, which is north of I-94 near the Coleman A. Young International Airport, there have been a lot of neighborhood flooding. You see street flooding, any rain event. It doesn't even have to be torrential rains, but any rain event, you'll see pools of water just standing in the street frequently. A lot of my neighbors have experienced basement backups. I've had 4 in the past since 2014 when we had the really torrential rains that caused a lot of damage across the entire region.
Warnings of imminent danger in Detroit's neighborhoods led to FEMA failing to assess damage. Many Detroit homes remain contaminated with standing water, black mold, and bacteria. Flooding and sewer backups continue, concentrated in neighborhoods built on floodplains, such as Jefferson Chalmers.
In 2014, in July that year, we had the largest FEMA disaster that year in the United States, where you had a 2-inch rain event that came so suddenly that you ended up having homes underwater, cars underwater, freeways underwater. A lot of basements had were flooded with water, and you had a lot of property destroyed that year.
The first time they helped us clean the basement. The second time they didn't want to help us clean basement. And it's really sad that to this day, and it's 2017 now, there's still people who have mold and stuff growing in their basement. They still have water and stuff growing in their basement that they can't get help. Until you live it, every time it rains, we get a sinking feeling in our stomach, because I don't know if it's going to flood again or not.
According to a recent report, fewer than half of the pumps in 3 pumping stations worked during 2 2016 rain events, causing major sewer backups and destroying millions of dollars in personal property, as well as destruction of water tanks, furnaces, furniture, carpeting, and prized family possessions. Many residents still wait for restitution, while others have initiated a lawsuit and the city has agreed to pay a multi-million-dollar payoff.
We have lost so many valuable things that they can't be replaced. And even though we put in a claim and we showed receipts of what we purchased it for, they told us it was depreciation, and they gave us half of what it was.
In July 2016, the Detroit Water and Sewerage Department announced plans to charge 22,000 property owners without water service $750 per impervious acre per month for stormwater drainage fees. Property owners who were previously charged based on meter size would begin being charged the same rate. After an outcry from churches, these fees were scaled back in April of 2017 to $125 per acre per month in year 1, increasing to $661 after 5 years.
What I feel like needs to happen is you need to keep the water from getting to the pipes in the first place. So you've got to catch it before it hits there. So you want to capture it from your downspout, and instead of it going into the old system, which it used to actually be an ordinance that you had to take your roof water straight into the pipes underground to the water treatment plant. Right. That was the ordinance. It was like ridiculous. Why would you ever want to do that? But that was the ordinance. That's what it said you had to do. And so now there's been this big effort to try to disconnect those, run them over your lawn, something like that, which is actually really important. Just doing that would be a huge step forward for people if they could just do that.
Alleviating the burden of water, the cost of water on residents. The Sierra Club a few years ago undertook a project, home water audits, where we would go into a person's home and ask them to invite others to come as well. And we would talk and educate around water conservation.
If you can capture that water, put it in a little rain garden, and let that water infiltrate back down into the groundwater, it never reaches the pipe in the first place. So you're taking water out of the system, so when the big storm happens, you just don't have as much flowing to it. Because it's a system which is old and crumbling, people have to kind of take this into their own hands and do their part.
The average water usage per person per day is 75 gallons. But if you're conserving your water, then that's more like 40 gallons per day. So you can use low-flow aerators, low-flow shower heads, a low-flush toilet. And one of the other most important things is to look for leaks. Another thing that we've promoted is the use of rain barrels. If people are harvesting or capturing rainwater off of their roof, they can then use that water to water their flowers or if they wash their cars.
One of the things I think the Water Department can and should do is work more closely with the community from a collaborative standpoint around problem solving. All of us understanding that there is a need for us to address gray infrastructure, for us to integrate green infrastructure into our work. Green infrastructure is the future because of the fact that a lot of the native plants that used to exist and make our soil work for us more efficiently are gone and have been replaced with turf grass. And when you have all of this turf grass, the roots are shallow, our soil has a heavy clay content, and water tends to pool above the ground instead of going underground.
Still, these deliberations fail to address freshwater scarcity in other states and worldwide. Lawmakers and citizens alike have commodified water. The burden, unevenly borne by poor people living in neglected communities, also results from irresponsible use on an individual level.
For me personally, there's this understanding of stewardship and safeguarding this rich asset called water, and then the humanity of the need and the call to share, and where that balance is met.
The most important things I think that the community should know about water is that it is a precious resource.
You don't get to carve out resources when things get tough and tight. People coming, and they're bringing their babies, and they're bringing their needs, and they're bringing their wrath if they need to. So you don't get that luxury, really. I mean, we have so many stewardship challenges of the water. It's a little difficult to be overly focused on somebody coming to take.
On an individual scale, I think that we can change how we behave.
We have to do what we can individually and collectively to protect it, to conserve it, because it's not just for us today. We have to think about future generations who will need to rely on this resource. So that means keeping it clean, making sure that we, reduce our litter in the city, because those things often end up in the sewer drains and sometimes even in the Detroit River.
We have to do better by what we have, particularly keeping it open to the public and accessible to the public, and not allowing for the corporatizing and profitizing from our water.
We can make sure that we are limiting our water use to necessary uses and stop doing unnecessary things like watering our lawns and washing our cars so often. We can stop having decorative uses for water like water fountains, and we have a big jacuzzi culture where everybody wants to get in a hot tub or a jacuzzi, and that's inefficient. We should be aware of that. If we care about fresh water, we should not overload our water treatment plants with medications, unused medications that we dump down our toilets because we don't need them anymore. We should be careful about what we dump into our toilets, understanding that all of that ends up in our water treatment plants. And our water treatment plants may have a limited capacity to clean out all of the impurities we flushed on our toilets. And we have a shared responsibility to keep water as clean as we can.
A failure to educate people on water and environmentalism has warped perceptions. Currently, advocacy focuses on remediating the effects on low-income, urban, and rural communities.
Right now, with the green stormwater infrastructure or green infrastructure, there are people looking at ways to create what's called a shared practice. I think some of the most important things that people should know about water, one is that there's one water. We often think and talk about water, sewage water, and stormwater, or water, sewage, and stormwater. But there's one water. So the water that we're drinking becomes sewage, goes out into source water, comes back as water for drinking. It's one water. And so we need to think of it that way, and I think we often don't. And I say that because maybe that highlights the need to protect it. If we realize every water, every drop of water, whatever happens to it, ultimately is the water that we're drinking.
Some of the natural solutions that we've been talking about and hearing about nationally, globally, and starting to bring to fruition here in the city, I think will be a great way to start dealing with some of those issues.
One of the challenges is that people resist paying these bills because they don't trust that they're fair. So one of the challenges in our community is widespread mistrust of the Detroit Water Department. Some of it's fair and some of it's not.
Moving forward, it would be great to see, much more collaboration between the grassroots efforts and the municipal decision makers. I think that's going to be key, so that those efforts are coordinated, that we're, maximizing our benefits, and ultimately bringing, higher quality of life opportunities to the residents and customers, if you will, of the municipal water utility.
Water scarcity affects everyone. Detroiters' increased awareness has created an opportunity to reframe our understanding of water.
Creating an open space plan now that they have an Office of Sustainability, which is great news. And that open space plan will look at, what are some of the productive things we can do with our open space, including green infrastructure or solar panels on land. And maybe there are ways to do community solar so that community residents within a certain community can benefit from the power that comes from those solar panels. So I think Detroit is kind of on a cusp. We have a tremendous, opportunity with our open space and vacant land, or our vacant land that becomes open space and usable space. And the community is certainly, I think, front and center in terms of seeing that happen. Detroit can really take full advantage of all that. We can be the greenest or most sustainable, or at least a highly sustainable city. So I'm excited, in terms of our future, the vision. I think the sky's the limit and we can do it.
We're trying to build awareness for the why of green infrastructure so that people buy in and understand it. We're trying to create green infrastructure projects that address multiple benefits for residents inside of neighborhoods beyond just billing, beyond even just fresh water, but addressing some of their pressing needs. And then what we're trying to do is to create demonstration projects so that people can see it working well. This year, one of the things we're also doing is we're creating a green workforce, a green team of people inside of our community who will be trained to build and maintain these vacant lots, because we believe the green economy, where businesses can establish green infrastructure installation and maintenance practices, and where workers can come in and do the work, is something that is part of a bright future in our community. What I would hate to see is outsiders from our community coming in and benefiting from the need and opportunity for green infrastructure. We are establishing a Hamilton outdoor rain garden, which is very exciting, across the street from Hamilton Elementary School. We're hoping that as people come through and look at the Hamilton outdoor rain garden classroom, they look to replicate that across the city. One of our exciting projects is we're taking 2 vacant lots on Mack Avenue, and we're going to convert them to transit parks with beautiful green infrastructure and public art. So we're really excited about that project.
Policy and individual behavior are inextricably linked. We must educate ourselves and our communities on actions we can take to enhance or preserve water quality. Individual actions have an impact, whether you are a politician trying to save money or a person watering your lawn irresponsibly.
My hope is that we will reduce our combined sewer overflows to 0. We need to have that as a goal. I think it's critical for Detroit to push towards not having any sewage overflows. No sewage. We want no sewage in our water.
What we're hoping is that landlocked businesses with high stormwater drainage fees will receive credits from investing in green infrastructure in neighborhoods across Detroit where there is vacancy.
I would like to see Lake Erie healthy again, where there are no harmful algal blooms and no threat of a toxin like the microcystin toxin. And I would like to see water provided to the average citizen at a rate that they can afford.
Well, if we don't deal with our broader infrastructure issues, I mean, the impacts can be devastating. You know, when you hear about communities like Flint and Toledo, who are very close to the city of Detroit, if we're not very careful and diligent to address our water infrastructure issues and also make sure that the public is engaged in that process, I think that the impacts can be devastating.
Detroit is like the big mama of the family of the United States Black urban centers of color. Detroit is big mama. And I always say, so goes Detroit, so goes the nation. And not only in urban centers and Black and brown people, but for all of us as a whole. And so when we allow bad policy in a city, it spreads. And it spreads now to a state. potentially, a state level. And so when you sit and watch and say, well, that's those people, they need something, it's coming to a state, place, paycheck near you, I promise.
We're going to have to build our community's capacity to administer green infrastructure, to plan it, and to maintain it. We have rain gardens across the city, and some people look at green infrastructure as something that is self-sustaining, but it's not. If you don't maintain these rain gardens and bioswales and bioretention gardens that are installed, what ends up happening is they no longer effectively manage stormwater, and stormwater ends up back inside the sewer systems. They become crowded with weeds, they're unattractive, and people resist the new installation of new projects. So there's a real opportunity for a green economy. What I would love for us to do is for us to support entrepreneurs and workers in the development of the skill sets needed to capitalize off of this new opportunity.